During the Cold War in Afghanistan, in order to counter the Soviet Union, the United States trained a group of jihadist fighters and provided them with all kinds of weapons. At the time, the US probably never imagined that one day the very people they trained would become terrorists and bring destruction to American soil. Buildings collapsed with a deafening roar. Thick black smoke rose straight into the sky, and all that remained was a pile of rubble. People fled in panic. Fear was written all over their faces, and their hearts were filled with hatred for terrorism. This was not the image of a battlefield, but the scene in the bustling city of New York on the morning of September 11th, 2001. On this day, 22 years ago, the United States suffered a terrorist attack, and within just 102 minutes, everything changed. 3,000 people died instantly. Over 6,000 were injured. This attack dealt a devastating blow to the United States. Afterward, the US launched a years-long war on terror, dragging countries like Afghanistan and Iraq into war as well. So what exactly was the 9/11 event? Why did it happen in the US, a global superpower? How was this attack carried out? Who was the mastermind behind it all? On the morning of September 11th, 2001, America welcomed a morning like any other. People getting ready for work, the city gradually becoming lively. President George W. Bush was attending an event at an elementary school in Florida when a series of strange events began to unfold. Around 8:46 a.m., a commercial airliner from American Airlines crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. This was American Airlines Flight 11, which had taken off at 8 a.m. from Logan International Airport in Boston, originally bound for Los Angeles. But just 15 minutes after takeoff, the plane was hijacked by 5 attackers. They disguised themselves as regular passengers, including one named Mohammed Atta. He had pilot training, was an Egyptian national, and only 33 years old. Atta and his accomplices stormed the cockpit, seized control of the plane, and then redirected it toward the World Trade Center, crashing it into the North Tower in front of countless witnesses. Flames burst out fiercely, thick smoke billowed up, and at that moment, President Bush was preparing to interact with students in a classroom. White House staffer Andrew Card informed him that a small aircraft had hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Bush listened but did not panic. He thought it was just an accident, maybe the pilot had a heart attack, and he decided to continue the classroom visit. Meanwhile, as the North Tower burned, rescue operations began. 17 minutes later, another plane, flying at extreme speed, crashed directly into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. This was United Airlines Flight 175, which took off at 8:14 a.m. and was hijacked by 5 terrorists after 28 minutes of flight. The hijackers killed the pilots, took control of the plane, and flew it straight into the South Tower. Andrew Card immediately informed President Bush, who was still reading with students, about the second crash. Though deeply shaken, President Bush remained composed and finished the reading activity. At the same time, chaos erupted across the United States, as citizens hadn't even recovered from the first shock. The second crash caused even greater panic. Many people lost their lives, and fear and confusion spread through the crowds. Within just 7 minutes, the whole world knew that the tallest buildings in the US, the World Trade Center towers, had been hit twice by planes. Soon after, more news came in. 2 more planes had been hijacked: American Airlines Flight 77 and United Airlines Flight 93. Flight 77 had taken off from Dulles International Airport in Washington, headed for Los Angeles, but was diverted at 8:54 a.m. There were also 5 hijackers on board. They stormed the cockpit about 31 minutes after takeoff. Flight 93 took off from New Jersey, bound for California, and was also seized by hijackers. Both planes were redirected toward Washington, D.C., close to the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense, and a symbol of national security and military strength. Tragically, the attackers targeted the Pentagon, and Flight 77, after being rerouted, crashed directly into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m., becoming the 3rd terrorist attack the U.S. suffered that day. Clearly, this chain of events was the result of a large-scale terrorist conspiracy. All airports in the U.S. were immediately shut down, and flights in the air were ordered to land at the nearest airport. The government and rescue forces struggled to control the situation, but for America, things only worsened. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center, severely damaged by fire and impact, completely collapsed. The American people witnessed it all firsthand. Chaos engulfed everything. Death and despair were everywhere. Many passengers, realizing they were under attack, bravely fought back. According to the FBI, passengers on Flight 93 made approximately 37 phone calls. Meanwhile, the US government was thrown into panic, fearing the next targets of the hijackers could be the White House or the Capitol. The White House is the workplace of the president, and the Capitol is the seat of the federal legislature. However, it was the passengers' courageous resistance that averted this disaster. Flight 93 crashed into a field in Pennsylvania before reaching its target. All passengers died, but thanks to them, an even greater tragedy was prevented. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center also collapsed in flames. Thick black smoke covered the New York sky, and more lives were lost. September 11th became one of the most horrifying days in American history, claiming nearly 3,000 lives and injuring over 6,000. This was the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history and severely discredited the U.S. intelligence community. As a superpower, America still couldn't escape the threat of radical Islamic militants. Bin Laden's plan had succeeded. The U.S. was plunged into overwhelming fear. President Bush had to remain on an airplane for hours, as it was believed that staying airborne was the safest option. The 9/11 attacks were a devastating blow to the American superpower, and their roots can be traced back to Afghanistan in 1979. Back then, to counter Soviet influence in Afghanistan, the US supported Mujahideen organizations, unintentionally helping create the terrorist networks that would later haunt them. Afghanistan's history is drenched in blood. Its people have always fought for freedom. In 1919, Afghanistan broke free from indirect British rule. In fact, after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, Britain had controlled Afghanistan's foreign policy. But after the Third War, Afghanistan achieved full independence. After independence, King Amanullah Khan worked to develop the nation. He was a progressive and reformist leader. In 1926, he abolished the Emirate of Afghanistan, established the Democratic Republic, and became its monarch. Under his rule, Afghan women were allowed to attend school and university for the first time. Society became infused with a spirit of openness and freedom. However, Amanullah Khan's reforms clashed with the interests of conservative Islamic factions, especially his policy on women's emancipation, which sparked fierce public backlash. In 1928, while Amanullah Khan was touring Europe, tribal leader Habibullah Kalakani seized the opportunity to stage a coup. With the royal army absent, he took power and exiled Amanullah Khan. In 1933, Zahir Shah became king of Afghanistan. During his 40-year reign, the country remained relatively stable and experienced some development. In 1973, while Zahir Shah was abroad, his cousin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, with support from parts of the military, communists, and leftist allies, staged a coup and overthrew the monarchy. Zahir was forced into exile. Afghanistan then entered a new era. Daoud Khan supported communist ideals and had close ties with the Soviet Union. He had long held a leadership role in the Afghan military, which received Soviet training during this period. The Soviet Union also heavily invested in Afghanistan. Upon taking power, Daoud Khan declared the establishment of the Republic of Afghanistan and named himself president. While he leaned on Soviet support, he also sought to build ties with the US to push for liberalization and avoid being dragged into the Cold War. However, this dual approach displeased the Soviets. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a communist party, was also dissatisfied with Daoud Khan. Eventually, they launched an assault on the royal palace, assassinated him and his family, and installed Nur Muhammad Taraki as president. But Taraki too was soon assassinated by his own comrades. Behind the 1978 events loomed Hafizullah Amin, the then Deputy Prime Minister of Afghanistan, who maintained good relations with the Soviet Union. He orchestrated the assassinations of pro-Soviet leaders, prompting the Soviets to take action. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union deployed hundreds of fighter jets and thousands of troops into Kabul. They swiftly seized control of the capital, killed President Amin, and installed Babrak Karmal as the new president. However, the 25,000 Soviet troops did not withdraw. They aimed to establish a communist regime in Afghanistan, but this ignited fierce resistance from Afghan Mujahideen, who viewed the Soviet action as a threat to Islam and vowed to fight to the end. Initially, This was merely a war between the Soviet Union and Afghan Islamic Mujahideen, but soon Pakistan, the United States, and some Middle Eastern countries joined in to support the Mujahideen, aiming to force the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan. Pakistan played a key role in this jihad, fully supporting the Mujahideen organizations. At the same time, Saudi Arabia began to provide substantial financial aid to the Mujahideen. Other countries also extended assistance to help the Mujahideen resist the Soviets. Thus, Afghanistan was plunged into a fierce conflict between communism and Islamic ideology. Against the backdrop of the Cold War, the United States had always sought to weaken Soviet influence in South Asia. Previously, the US had suffered setbacks in the Vietnam War and the Korean War at the hands of the Soviets. The Afghan War presented the US with an opportunity, and it began to support the Afghan uprising against the Soviets. The US not only influenced the Afghan War through neighboring countries like Pakistan, but also promoted the war as a battle for Islam, encouraging young people from all Islamic countries to join in. The US provided them with large amounts of weapons, funding, and intelligence support. These actions gave rise to the jihad movement and brought chaos to Afghanistan. As a nation committed to promoting Islam, Saudi Arabia feared that Soviet influence would pose a threat to Islam. Therefore, it rallied many young people from Middle Eastern countries to join jihadist organizations. Some wealthy Islamic families also began to sponsor these groups. Osama bin Laden was one of them. He was determined to implement Islamic law across all Muslim countries, to handle internal affairs strictly according to the Quran, and to oppose any external interference, even from a superpower like the United States. Eventually, on February 15, 1988, the Soviet Union officially withdrew from Afghanistan, but relations between the US and Afghanistan did not improve. The Mujahideen, who were once supported by the US to fight the Soviets, now turned their weapons toward the US. Bin Laden believed that US involvement in the Gulf War was a grave mistake. The US attack on Iraq and its support for Israel further intensified his hatred toward America. In a 2002 letter, bin Laden stated that US support for Israeli expansion was a crime, and that he and al-Qaeda would make America pay for it. Upholding extremist Islamic ideology, bin Laden traveled to Abbottabad, Pakistan, to support jihadist organizations. He also founded al-Qaeda, with the goal of launching a global Islamic revolution and carrying out continuous jihad. Initially, their goal was to drive the Soviet Union and the communist regime out of Afghanistan. But after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, bin Laden turned his attention to Iraq. In 1991, the US launched an attack on Iraq, which bin Laden considered a severe affront to Islam. He was dissatisfied with the US's growing influence in Muslim countries, especially in Kuwait, Iraq, and Somalia. He viewed this as American imperialism. Furthermore, in his eyes, US support for Israel also signified hostility toward Islam. From that point on, bin Laden adopted a firm anti-American stance. The man who once cooperated with the US against the Soviets completely changed sides. At the time, the Taliban had established a regime in Afghanistan. Bin Laden moved there and used it as the base for al-Qaeda operations. In 1996, he issued a fatwa demanding the withdrawal of US troops from Saudi Arabia, where the US had maintained military bases since the Gulf War. In 1998, bin Laden issued another fatwa, and in August of that year, carried out bomb attacks on US embassies in East Africa, resulting in more than 200 deaths. Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were both hit in these attacks. These bombings further solidified bin Laden's determination to cause even greater destruction in the US. He planned the darkest day in US history, the 9/11 attacks from Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks had both immediate and far-reaching impacts. They united the American public. People across the country participated in rescue efforts and did their best to save lives. At 8:30 p.m. that evening, President George W. Bush addressed the nation, stating unequivocally that there would be no distinction between the terrorists who carried out the attacks and those who supported them. The 9/11 incident not only destroyed the lives of many Americans, but also sparked a deep yearning for justice and widespread anger. Soon after, President Bush announced that the attack was the work of Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group, al-Qaeda. At the time, al-Qaeda was operating in Afghanistan. The US president demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden, but the Taliban refused and insisted that the US provide evidence. The US then launched the War on Terror, with NATO countries rallying to support it. The war began in Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, the US and its allies entered Afghanistan to launch military operations against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The US not only attacked al-Qaeda bases, but also targeted the Taliban. During the investigation, the US obtained numerous video clues. The FBI also found that the 19 hijackers involved in the 9/11 attacks had been trained by bin Laden. These attackers had been divided into groups and infiltrated the US, with some even receiving flight training. All of the terrorists held valid documents and had successfully entered the US. On October 26, 2001, the US Congress passed the Patriot Act, aimed at capturing the terrorists behind the 9/11 attacks. This act granted the government expanded powers to conduct surveillance on those suspected of terrorism. To hunt down bin Laden and destroy the al-Qaeda network, the US invested huge sums of money and deployed powerful military forces. Although al-Qaeda was forced underground and many terrorists were killed by US forces, bin Laden managed to evade capture for years. During this time, the US also launched military operations in Iraq, suspecting connections to al-Qaeda. The war dragged on for years. The 9/11 attacks were not only a terrorist act, but also a major blow to US intelligence agencies. People began to wonder how such a massive attack could have been planned and executed right under the noses of the FBI and CIA. In 2002, President Bush appointed a commission to investigate the 9/11 attacks. The final report was submitted 2 years later. The results revealed serious failures within the intelligence agencies. The CIA had long known that 2 of the hijackers were members of al-Qaeda and had tracked them when they attended a terrorist meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. But the CIA neither informed the FBI of this information nor added them to the watch list. As a result, the 2 terrorists easily entered the US, lived like ordinary people, and ultimately carried out a catastrophic attack. This was a clear lapse on the part of the CIA, and 3,000 Americans paid with their lives. To capture those truly responsible for 9/11, the US fought a 10-year war in Afghanistan, spending enormous resources. It wasn't until 2011 that the US finally achieved a breakthrough. In May 2011, US Navy SEALs located bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed him in a special operation. Bin Laden's death was a major victory for the US in the war on terror, but the impact of 9/11 on ordinary Americans continues to this day. The reasons bin Laden launched the 9/11 attacks were partly due to growing US interference and influence in the Middle East, and partly because he saw the US as an oppressor of Muslims. However, after the 9/11 attacks, these 2 problems not only remained unresolved, but actually became worse. The US invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. Moreover, some Western countries, especially the US, began to experience a severe wave of Islamophobia. The atrocities committed by Middle Eastern terrorists caused Muslim citizens and South Asians to suffer, and crimes and discrimination against them in the US surged dramatically. Muslims in America not only faced discrimination, but were even persecuted in some areas. Even Indian Sikhs in the US were often mistaken for Muslims and attacked. The American public's fear of Muslims gave rise to extremism, and many Muslims were imprisoned or even killed as a result. Massive human rights violations continued to occur, causing some people, out of frustration and anger due to discrimination and oppression, to take the path of terrorism. Although the US avenged 9/11 by killing bin Laden, Afghanistan and Iraq paid a heavy price. Countless innocent civilians lost their lives. Both countries fell into political and economic chaos, and Afghanistan, in particular, was reduced to a battlefield, still under Taliban rule to this day.